Hi, my name's Laird, and I want to thank you all for coming to this panel on cultural appropriation, which our festival organizers have described in the following terms. Can writers and artists become whomsoever they want to be? Or are they morally bound to write about where they belong and what they know, understand, and can substantiate? Is the rooted imagination truer than the borrowed one? Can the values of empathy outweigh identity thefts and exotic stereotyping? A crucial session that debates who holds the copyright on authenticity across geographies and cultural landscapes. The panelists, all writers, may choose to address the way they have dealt with cultural appropriation in their own work, how it has affected their work as writers and artists in the world, how it has played out in their lives, and how they see it playing out in the lives of others. The subject intersects with many of the conversations already held and thoughts already expressed at this excellent edition of JLF. Questions of nationalism, globalism, universalism, as evoked by Omar El-Akkad, ancestral cultures, feminism, and indeed the whole notion, as we've seen it during panels on travel writing and journalistic endeavor, of going out into the world and reporting back. We have 5 different writers before us, and so I imagine there will be both overlap and divergence in response to a subject that tends to raise artistic and intellectual temperatures. And I can't wait to hear what everyone has to say. And while my charge this morning is to moderate, I do think it's important to note at the outset, and perhaps by way of brief self-introduction, that for the past decade I've been writing a quartet of novels set in the American past, which features voices of kick-ass women, to borrow Anita Anand's phrase from yesterday's Feminisms Across Cultures panel, in difficult, not to say impossible, contexts and situations. Pre-Civil War slavery, the Civil War itself, and Jim Crow-afflicted America. So this conversation on cultural appropriation is terribly important to me. I feel like I'm always learning around it, and since that learning happens through listening and engaging, let's turn to our excellent panelists. So everyone's going to make an initial remarks, and then we'll have some conversations in time for a conversation with you as well. So in the order in which I'll ask them to present, not in the order in which they're seated, bounce things around a bit. Stephen Graham Jones is the author of 16 novels and 6 story collections. So Stephen's sitting in the middle. And I'll introduce everyone before I ask Stephen to speak. Most recent are Mapping the Interior and the comic book My Hero. He's the recipient of a Texas Institute of Letters Award and is a National Endowment for the Arts Fellow in Fiction. He lives and teaches right here in Boulder, Colorado. To my immediate right, Yasmin Abdel-Magied is a mechanical engineer, social advocate, the author of a coming-of-age memoir called Yasmin's Story, and she is the 2015 Queensland Young Australian of the Year. She advocates for the empowerment of youth, women, and those from racially, culturally, and linguistically diverse backgrounds, and is passionate about making diversity the norm. On the far side, Jovan Mays is the Emeritus Poet Laureate of Aurora, Colorado, a National Poetry Slam champion, curator of a story, a student narrative project in Aurora Public Schools, a TED speaker and director of Your Writing Counts, a youth poetry program throughout the Denver metro area that engages just over 200,000 students annually. And Hillerman, next to Jovan, is an award-winning novelist and journalist, the author of several nonfiction books, and the daughter of New York Times bestselling author Tony Hillerman. Songs of the Lion is her 3rd novel. Check it out. And then next to Yasmin, Saikat Mujumdar is the author most recently of Playhouse, a novel which was a finalist for the Bangalore Literature Festival Fiction Prize and the Mumbai Film Festival Word to Screen Market. It is currently being developed into a screenplay. He is professor of English and creative writing at Ashoka University in India and a fellow at the Newhouse Center for the Humanities at Wellesley College for this academic year. So with that, I'll turn it over to Stephen.
Cultural appropriation. When somebody talks to me about cultural appropriation, I think of I think of Andre 3000 in a headdress, at the Grammys or something like that. And then, the next day on social media, all the Indians are mad about it. He can't do that. He doesn't know what a headdress means. It's not his culture and everything. And we kind of have the moral high ground there, you know, because he's just using it for a style, and to us it matters, and we can win that. We can win that real easy. You know, we can say you're wrong, we're right, but the problem is, I think when we set ourselves up to be kind of, I don't know, gatekeepers like that or police, when all we do is kind of complain about people wearing headdresses, then that kind of casts us as the victim, and it kind of reinstates what America wants everybody to believe about us, that we're the victim. So I really think that all this, like when we get mad about somebody wearing a headdress in a music act, that's really us falling for bait. Well, the issues that really matter for American Indians are matters of sovereignty and repatriation. And when we get too wrapped up about Andre 3000 wearing a headdress, then we've been distracted. We're not paying attention to what we should be paying attention to before. What we were paying attention to. We're not paying attention to what we should be paying attention to, and I think that's dangerous. I think sovereignty and repatriation are where it's at. You know, it's not about who gets to wear a feather, who doesn't get to wear a feather. And as for authenticity, yeah, you can tell. I don't know if you can tell. I don't know how you tell if a text is authentic, if that person is within that culture. In American Indian stuff, you can do it by a blood quantum, but that's just a thing laid down by the government. You know, that's pretty stupid. I think you can do it by, are you plugged into your culture? At some point, though, trying to do the authenticity shuffle, it comes down to one person saying, you're Indian, you're not Indian, you can write about this, you can't. And I think that's really dangerous to create like a country club of exclusive and inclusive, you know? I think where a text becomes American Indian or doesn't become American Indian is on the page only. You should never flip to the author photo and say, oh, she looks like she fits my conception of Indian, so she must be Indian. You know, I think that's a weak way to grant a text legitimacy or authenticity. My first novel that came out, the publisher kept hitting me up for an author photo, and I kept resisting because I'm so tired of smiling Indians on the back of novels, you know? And so I kept saying, no, I don't want to do that, and they kept insisting. I didn't have any publishing weight to throw around. This is back in 1999. And so finally what I did was I went to the park and played basketball, and I had my wife stand like 300 yards away in the bushes, and she took a picture of me where I was like this big. And she tried to get an action shot, but they didn't like that at all. So we came back to our living room. We had this tan carpet in the living room, and I laid down on the carpet, and I used to have really long hair. She brushed my hair out in a big circle around me, and she stood over me and took a picture, and we mailed that in, and that did not fly either. But I wanted to do whatever I could to read. I didn't want people to read this book had a lot of like identity politics and, you know, land grabs and all that stuff in the novel. I didn't want people flipping to the back and saying, oh, he's Indian, I can listen to him. I think the text should have the authority itself, not the person.
I wish I lived in a world where the text had the authority and not the person. I think the conversation around cultural appropriation is often, we attempt to have it in binaries. We attempt to have it in extremes. We attempt to say, you can or can't do this, and use absolutes. When something like culture is nothing, there is nothing in culture that is absolute. There is nothing in any of these conversations that is absolute, and to try to make it absolute, I think, is where it becomes dangerous. I will never say to someone, you cannot categorically write something. Who am I to tell them what they can and can't write? But what I can say is look at the context in which you are writing this. For me, the conversation about cultural appropriation is not about the here and the now. It's about zooming out and looking at the power structures that exist in our society. Looking at historically who has been allowed to write what and how that's set us up to where we are now. Whose voice is given authority simply by them being a certain type of person. And being real about those sorts of things. If I write a book about Sudan versus some white journalist going to Sudan, spending a week there writing a book about it, who do you think people are going to listen to? Who do you think we listen to when we think about the Middle East? Who are the journalists that we listen to? Are they Arab men or women that have grown up there that can talk about the history of it? Or is it somebody who's spent some time there, maybe even a couple of years, and all of a sudden they're experts? This goes back to the colonizers going in and saying, we have seen how these people live, and we are going to bring civilization to them. They are the other, they are the savages. That is the root of it. It's the fact that those power structures, whether they are that obvious or not anymore, they still exist in our world. And so when some white bloke writes a story about a Nigerian woman, sure, it might be really authentic, but more often than not, they're really lazy in how they go about it. Right? They fall in these stereotypes that are so boring. Tell me a story written by someone who's not a Muslim that gives a Muslim woman some, like, actual agency and doesn't talk about her headscarf. Because if you're looking at someone from the outside, all you're interested in is what you're interested in, more often than not. If you're going to take the time and do the work and write an incredibly nuanced character that is from a different world, props to you. That's awesome. But more often than not, that doesn't happen. More often than not, we fall back on tropes and stereotypes. And the reality is those tropes and stereotypes do not exist in a vacuum. They affect and reflect people that exist today. When people write terrible, when people write stereotyped characters that are Arab or Muslim or black, imagine if you've never met an Arab or Muslim or black person. You're going to read this fiction book and think, oh, maybe they are actually like that. Because we believe stories. Even if we're like, oh, but it's fiction, it doesn't affect reality. Please. The stories that we tell do affect our reality, do affect how we go into the world. And so to think that we do not have responsibility as writers, whether we write fiction or non-fiction, I think is negligent. And I think those who think that they don't have to worry about it, that is privilege. Because you can write whoever you want, however you want, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't affect you. But it affects me. As a woman, as a person of color, as a Muslim. Those stories affect my daily life. As to ownership, I mean, who can say who owns what? Nobody has like a definitive ownership over anything. But if a hell of a lot of marginalized people are saying, hey, I feel like you're taking something away from me. You took my land, you took my power, and now you want to take my dignity, and you're like, oh man, I don't really care. Who's the one with the problem? I think it's a conversation that is not about extremes. It's not about sushi in a canteen. It's not about sombreros. That's the pointy end of a much more complex and much more deeply historically entrenched issue to do with power structures, to do with identity, to do with who gets to be, I guess, the holder of culture. And that needs to be taken really seriously.
Jovan.
I tend to think in more simple terms sometimes. I don't understand why it's so hard to ask questions. What I always get caught up in the act of an appropriation, which in my head I believe that most of us who are writers are appropriators to a degree. I have appropriated my grandmother a lot. I make that evaluation on the lightning that hasn't struck me. And the people in my life, you know that I dive into them first person is a lot of times from my experience with them. So I think to a degree, it's important to take on the fact that we all kind of, you know, tinker our tile the way that we tinker our tile on our abacus. When it comes down to when you're really in a position to probably bring some threat, I think that's where I get a little dumbfounded by why it's so difficult to just ask that person a question. And why can't your interview be more powerful than the character that you create? And why I think everybody likes, to a degree, just being granted a certain amount of permission. And permission is also a thing inside of this dialogue that is flexible, right? Oftentimes you see a writer write in a certain style and you think, okay, I can write in that style myself. That's permission that you've taken, right? But balancing how that permission kind of works is a big thing inside of ourselves. But when I think about cultural appropriation, and I don't know, sometimes like these words like appropriation, I feel like, even though I don't know the etymology of appropriation, I just feel like we like use these like new words for like people just like jacking somebody else's stuff. That's just like, okay, we got a cool word for it now. And it's all academic, and now we can talk about it because it's long, like I don't understand. And so for me, I think back to this. I was doing some hurricane relief aid, August 2005, in the 7th Ward in New Orleans, and I'll never forget, I'm talking to this brother, and I remember being just mesmerized by him because I had never seen a black man with blue eyes, and I was just like, this dude is the coolest dude. And he's telling me about, how tragic all this is down here, and we're doing our best to try to console people who have went through a really tragic situation. And this older, cute white lady with nice khakis, a yellow polo, and beige Velcro shoes comes storming up to us. She's fresh off of a tour bus with her other comrades. And she hands me a camera and says, "Do you mind if I take a picture with the Katrina fella?" And I remember thinking to myself, this is kind of cultural appropriation. It is clear that your hands can help this environment somehow. But instead, this is this cultural piece that you want to take back with you. I remember on the ride home thinking about other environments that have went through tragedy. Do people try to take a piece of their tragedy home? Do they try to take dime bag packets filled with ash or souvenirs from Auschwitz? Do they try to take sepia-toned Wild West photos of them holding AKs and blackface and camouflage in Rwanda? Is this how we kind of adjust in what we take home? And I think that a lot of times we try to pretend as a culture that we're better than that. And I wish I could speak on behalf of all the places that the panelists here are from, but from being just an observer in America and being a grandson to a Black Panther, I just think that I've sat and watched the world and seen these sort of hijackings and with no inquisition whatsoever. So to me, that's cultural appropriation.
Well, your story about Katrina made me think of something that is actually pretty trivial, but kind of to the same point. So I write about the Navajo who have like the biggest reservation in the United States. The Navajo Nation is a lot of Arizona, stretches into New Mexico, Utah. So I was at a restaurant in Gallup, and it's a wonderful restaurant. Outside, they have a lot of native artists. It's kind of like eating in a flea market because the artists come in and sell you whatever they have. And at the table next to me, there was a woman, and this Navajo lady came, and she had a turquoise necklace. And I was eavesdropping because that's what all of us writers do. And the lady said, "How much is the necklace?" And the artist said, "It's $25. And the woman said, "I'll take it." And then the woman gave her the money, and then she said, "Is it real turquoise?" And the lady said, "Sure, it's turquoise." And then her husband said, "Is it treated turquoise? Is it stabilized turquoise?" And the lady said, "It's turquoise." And the woman said, "I think it's stabilized." And she said, "It's turquoise." And the color was turquoise. And I thought, of course, The color is turquoise, and this is like just one of those little cultural deals where people think they're speaking the same language, they think they're on the same page, but they really are not quite communicating. I know the Arapahoes have a saying that there are only a certain number of stories in the universe, and that each story kind of waits for the person to come along who can tell that story. And I think my dad started writing about the Navajos back in 1970. And when he began his series, there were a lot of really vicious stereotypes about Indians. Mostly Indians were sidekicks. They were, you all know the stereotypes. And so in my dad's first novel, he created this character, Joe Leaphorn, who was a Navajo policeman. But Joe Leaphorn was not the main character. There was this white anthropologist who was the crime solver. And my dad submitted this book to New York, and his New York editor said, you know, your Navajo character is a lot more interesting. And he was. And so my dad then made Joe Leaphorn into the main character, and 19 books later, Joe Leaphorn continued. And over the years, my dad had a lot of response from Navajo people, as I have had. My third novel just got published. And it was mixed. Some of the Navajos would say to him, you know, I love your stories. I love the way you are shining a positive light on our culture, on our history. And some people would say, who are you, a boy from Oklahoma, to write about the Navajos? And my dad would say, well, you know, I'm not a sociologist. I'm not an anthropologist. I'm a fiction writer. And I do a lot of research learning about the Navajo culture, and if people don't like it, they don't have to read it, but I do my best to make it authentic. And as time went on, the Navajo people began teaching my dad's books in the high schools, and I think a lot of young Dene people then also became writers because they were able to see a reflection of themselves, even though it was through a white guy's eyes, a reflection of themselves in a positive way. So when I decided to take over the series, I did think about this because I thought, you know, I'm going to run into, you know, some of the same arguments, which I think are valid arguments. But I thought all I can do is do my best research, do a really positive portrayal of, I mean, the cultural, I would kind of call it cultural appreciation. Do the best I can do of writing good, compelling mystery stories that also show these people for whom I have enormous respect in a positive light. And the thing that makes me feel the best, I think more than, you know, book sales or anything, is when I'm doing a signing and a Dene grandma and her daughter and her granddaughter come up and they say, we'd like to have our picture taken with you. And the reason that happens is that my protagonist is a young Navajo woman who's a crime solver, who is probably, I mean, there are 350,000 Navajos, so I'm sure there are people out there who say, no, 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 my daughter would never do this, my granddaughter would never do this. But I think there's enough resonance in what I am writing and what a little tiny bit of the truth is about the Navajo people that I've had a good response. And if people say to me, you know, we wouldn't have never done that in my family, I think, well, that's a valid thing. But me as a white girl from Santa Fe, if I were writing about how I spent Christmas, you know, I'd say, well, so we go to midnight mass, we open our presents on Christmas Eve. And chances are another white girl from Santa Fe could say, no, 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 we open our presents on Christmas Day, and we go to go to midnight mass, we go to watch the dances at House Pueblo, whatever. I think there's just diversity is what makes literature fascinating. And I think and imagination is the other part. And I think, I don't know, I guess cultural, it just seems like as a writer, the world is open to us, and we just need to do the best we can to appreciate all those resources and treat them with respect.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. As a fiction writer, I have to start by saying that I think writing itself is appropriation. You know, I think Johan put it very well that he appropriates his grandmother, and she probably didn't protest too much about it. even if she did. So it is really about, as I said yesterday in a panel, it's about inhabiting otherness. Unless you're writing just an autobiography. And even then, there are other people, there are other voices. It's, I mean, all art for me is kind of an endless tension between the familiar and the alien. You need something familiar, you need something alien. You can't give up one for the other, you need both. And in our writing, in our teaching, we are always telling people to appreciate realities which don't belong to them, whether it's historical, whether it's cultural, whether it's, it's always other. And it's, that's why I guess getting a voice, speaking in a voice, I think that's why so much fiction has an autobiographical element, because that's something we all know well, but we also have to transcend it. We can't just write about that. I mean, those of you who know the history of the English novel will remember that the English novel was originated as a famous act of appropriation. That was Samuel Richardson was a popular letter writer, a kind of a scribe for working class women, maids basically who were not literate and who had to write to their lovers. And Richardson used to write those letters. And he was so good at it, he was so good at writing these letters that his first two novels, Pamela and Clarissa, were epistolary novels which were basically kind of born out of those letters. And so that's right there, the history of the novel. In fact, he did also publish a novel called Charles Grandison, A Voice of a Man. Apparently Richardson really sucked at speaking as a man. And he was much better at speaking as a working class illiterate woman. So, I mean, I think this is always there. We always speak as others. The problem starts when we assume the voice of someone in a social group who is disempowered in relation to us. So the fact is, if I speak as a white guy, and a white guy speaks as me, we all know which one is going to be more problematic. I mean, there will be problems on both sides, but the fact is that the white guy will be kind of, and that's because not of who's appropriating who, but because what relation these cultures have with each other. That's when it becomes a question of do you have the right to speak? Because, literature itself, the fact is, it is a very bourgeois art form. It originates with the Enlightenment, with the culture of print. It is inseparable from the middle class. It is much more bourgeois and much more exclusive than, say, music or dance or many other folk art forms. Even more than film, a more modern art form. And that's because one has to be literate. One has to be literate. One has to have a certain degree of isolation, a certain degree of leisure, a certain degree of privilege to be able to both sit and write. And that is the story of literature. And that's why any kind of literary representation can be an act of appropriation for groups who are never part of this modernity. And this is something writers have written about a lot. I mean, James Coetzee has this wonderful parodic piece called A Novel in Africa, where it's this Australian novelist who's on a cruise ship, she's giving this talk, and then this black Nigerian novelist who's now a performer comes and says that novels, we don't do novels. We're not an isolated, we are communal, we are bodily, we are sexy, we perform. And all of that is to be taken to a pinch of salt, but the fact is, the idea is that the literature itself becomes an act of appropriation for these cultures who never saw themselves rooted in this kind of bourgeois modernity from which the novel originates. So the moment you represent, the moment you do that, that is an act of appropriation, which I think is different from how it happens in music or how it happens in other art forms. And it always has two sides, like it works both ways. So if you are a black guy, must you only write about, basketball and rap? Can you not write about Mozart and Shakespeare? It's a problem which I've seen a lot of my fellow writers face, a lot of my fellow scholars face. So somebody who's of South Asian or Caribbean origin, I'm writing on Shakespeare, I'll never get a job because nobody will think I can write on Shakespeare because I must write about my story. I must write about where I am. So you can also get boxed in. You can, so that in a way you also need the right to appropriate. So the question is not so much about appropriation. The question is about power, about what power this has. I mean, you know, it's a risky thing because as a novelist, I haven't done much appropriation myself. Both of my novels have been set in Calcutta. They have been set in a reality I know, and yet the present self that I inhabit is not that interesting to me. It is to bourgeois. So my way of appropriating it has been appropriating childhood, has been appropriating another time, and childhood has been a more visceral, a more raw, a more vulnerable time, which has somehow messed with the bourgeois sensibility which I'm really tired of, which I think we need to escape and break out of as writers, which songwriters, which performers do so beautifully, but as writers we are so trapped. And that's something I've done, I've tried to do repeatedly, and yet it is something, it is me, but it's not me. It is me from a different part. So what is appropriation? I think we have to appropriate as writers, but the question is, what is the power relation that exists? Thank you.
So before I see if the panelists want to follow up with each other and ask each other questions, I wanted to put something to you, and it sort of bubbles up out of what a number of you were talking about. It has to do with terminology around this issue, and a lot of you were evoking interesting things and touching on interesting things around this. And what do we mean exactly by cultural appropriation, and this notion of a kind of one-size-fits-all term for what is perhaps plural within that category. And so thinking about this notion of cultural appreciation, Jovan evoking, you know, this is basically people stealing from other people. You know, on the one hand, we have, you know, Yasmin, you evoked this notion of, you know, who can make sushi and so forth, and that's, but you know, that seems like another part of the conversation, as you put it. Cultural exchange is often brought up, right? Where this is an exchange, but of course, Saikat problematizes that because this is a question of power and power dynamics, and who has power and who's doing this exchange, right? It's, you know, kids in the lunchroom sharing lunch. I'll have that. Thank you. I'll have that peanut butter sandwich very much, and we're doing an exchange. And here's my carrot thrown back at you, right? And so thinking about just a couple of interesting articulations I've found around what it is we're talking about with cultural appropriation. Writing in Everyday Feminism, Maisha Z. Johnson says, in short, cultural appropriation is when somebody adopts aspects of a culture that's not their own. But that's only the most basic definition. A deeper understanding of cultural appropriation also refers to a particular power dynamic in which members of a dominant culture take elements from a culture of people who have been systematically oppressed by that dominant group. That's why cultural appropriation is not the same as cultural exchange. When people share mutually with each other, because cultural exchange lacks that systemic power dynamic. And then just slightly different articulation. Susan Scafidi, who teaches at Fordham University, says that cultural appropriation is taking intellectual property, traditional knowledge, cultural expressions, or artifacts from someone else's culture without permission. And I was reading recently an article by Brianna Joy Gray, who said something that I found interesting. I'm curious to see what you think about this. She's already worn out on this cultural appropriation word and this term. And she says, perhaps what we're talking about, on the one hand, is cultural exploitation, and then on the other is cultural disrespect. And so I wonder if any further thoughts on this question of terminology and how it boxes us in, how perhaps it shapes the conversation unfairly, not usefully, or perhaps you do see as useful, this notion of appropriation. Any thoughts from you? Stephen?
I like that permission, you were talking about permission, and I get that a lot. People come to me asking for permission to write about Indians, and I'm like, I'm not the dude to come to, you know? Nobody told me I can give you permission. Just do what you're gonna do. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't, you know? who can know? I mean, I don't get permission to write the things I write either. You know, I'm zombies and werewolves, so there's nobody I can ask for that.
I think I know a guy.
But as novelists, I don't know. I mean, do I even have permission to write about Indian stuff? You know, I mean, I didn't ask anybody from my nation if I could do that. I don't think novelists should ever ask for permission, actually. I think we should always do it. That's what I think.
I was in conversation recently with Colson Whitehead, the novelist of The Underground Railroad, which a number of you will have read, the one Pulitzer Prize, National Book Award, etc., just a couple of weeks ago. And this question came up. This topic was race in America that we were in conversation around. The moderator put this question to us, and Colson immediately pounded his legs and said, writers need to be able to write about whatever they need to be able to write about. And if they get it wrong, then they try harder next time. And that's what he said. Right, so that's his take on it, but it sort of rhymes for me with what you're proposing. But I suspect that there are other takes on it.
I think creativity doesn't work well with asking permission. And there was, in that early, the description of this workshop, it said something about writing about where you belong. Do you remember that? That really annoyed me. I think part of the pleasure of being writers is to write about places we've never thought we would even go to. I mean, that's the joy and the spark and the energy, I think, of being a writer. That kind of permission to fail, permission to go out on the high wire and fall off with a thud, and nobody ever has to read it. I mean, but just, it seems like that kind of freedom is what gives writers their energy. And I don't even know who I would ask permission to come up with mystery stories that have a brilliant young woman as a crime solver. I mean, I talked to the Navajo police, and they're happy to be heroes, but I don't know, the idea of asking permission to be creative just really makes my hair stand on end.
It gives them the permission, it gives them the energy and the arrogance, right? Like, imagine if we were sitting here and rather than cultures we were talking about gender, and there are a bunch of guys being like, hey, we should be able to write whatever we want about women. Why should we ask for permission? Well, I mean, and if we get it wrong, does it really matter? Right, like women, I mean, who would I ask, my wife? Right, like, I think it's so fascinating to me because we can have conversations around terminology, and it kind of cloaks, you know, as you say, there is no one definite definition for cultural appropriation. And it's like one of those terms like globalization or things that get bandied about for people's particular, for whatever people want to use it in a particular context. But I think, yeah, you know, you can write whatever you want, but the reality is it does come back to power dynamics, right? I can write what I want, but you know what? Sometimes if I write what I want, I am going to be beaten down for that. Whereas if somebody else writes that exact same thing, they're going to get a pass, right? If I want to write about, you know, say if I want to write my version of the other side of the war on terror, say, and how would that play out versus someone like you, Led, writing about the other side of the war on terror? It would be so, oh, people would be like, how exotic, how fantastic, you've stepped into the mind of the ISIS fighters. And I would be thrown into Guantanamo Bay. Right? Kind of not that funny when you think about it. Right? Because like again, we can write about what we want, but that completely ignores the context of the world that we live in. And we can talk about appropriation on stages like this, and then outside, real people's lives are affected by it. And we have to remember that. Like, our words have an impact. The way we frame stories have impact in this world. Open Up the Heart of Darkness, which still gets read in universities and in schools. And what does that say about my continent? What does it say about people who are not fair-skinned? Read Abdel-Magied's Orientalism and think about how Arabs and Muslims are systematically throughout history othered and exoticized. And that hasn't changed. These words, these stories do make an impact. And yes, we can want to think that as writers, we can write whatever we want, and that's great, because I want to be creative. Well, la-di-da, I don't want to go to jail. I don't want to get killed. I don't want my family members to be bombed. But that's what the extension of that looks like for me. And that's why it matters. These are not conversations that exist in a vacuum.
Before we turn it over to the audience,
yeah, well, you know, Franz Kafka appropriated Beatles. George Orwell appropriated pigs. You know, obviously they were not in a position to protest. I think a crucial question is, you know, and this is like, again going back to what fiction writers speak as. We speak as tables, chairs, Beatles. The question is whether the social group is in a position to speak. So that's one of the greatest ironical logics of minority power, is that unless you're enough of a majority, you actually lose the voice. So if you're truly marginal, you actually don't have a voice at all. Which is why I think the fact about literature being a bourgeois art form is very important, because that immediately excludes a lot of social groups. And then there's another point, I think Anne really brought it up, the question of freedom, that art is not really subject to the same kind of morality as the world out there. So the biggest question, whether I can speak for somebody who I'm not, is really at the end a very simple and banal question. Does it ring true? True, not real. These are different things. You know, the true is sometimes not real, but it can be true. And I mean, you can't really, I think the problem is a lot of where I'm coming from, writers from sort of developing sort of post-colonial writers, to use an academic term, often feel that we must represent our culture in a responsible light. We must show the best of it with development, and that we are doing good things. That what about the decadence? And a binary kind of gets created. Now white writers show the poverty, and we show the, but you know, we should be free of those things. In my last novel, Playhouse, I talk about a communist government in Calcutta and how, for them, theatre and prostitution, that memory of actresses being in theatre or being prostituted, that hadn't gone up in this morality. And it's a very despondent, very stagnant world. It's not a pretty picture. So I've never been accused of any kind of nostalgia or romance. I'm somebody who romanticizes. But it's also not just showing something as negative. It's that stagnancy and that pain is aesthetically compelling. It's riveting. It's mesmeric. And this is outside the morality of the good or bad that dominates the world of the political. Art has its own rules. Art is neither moral nor immoral. It is really amoral. And that is what, and it overlaps with, it coincides with the world of real politics, but it is not reducible to it. It is always separate. And at the end of the day, it's the same question. Did it work for you? If it didn't, it didn't. No amount of theory can make it right. No amount of political, and often we read this really politically correct books which are so dead. And of course we all know, I mean, think of a book like Lolita. Like, why is it a book about pedophilia so powerful? I mean, so it's very hard to say this thing. So there is a connection, and yet the true of art is not the same as the real. It's not the same as the politically correct in the world. It is not divorced from it, but it's not reducible to it.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree with that. And I think where I get a little hung up on is that I do feel like there is more reality to the written word than there is to like graphic art. So when we dance this line of being able to describe what is bourgeois and what is not bourgeois, we have to be really, really delicate about where that line sits. I like this idea of true. I like the idea if I had, I don't know, like a really boisterous, like Native family of you walking in and reading some excerpts from your book and seeing if that passes through that filter test. And I like that idea of true. But I don't believe that it's that far on the edge of spectrum that it doesn't have responsibility. I do not give it that credence as a writer. If I choose to wear someone else's skin and walk around on it, especially at my gala where everybody's like drinking white wine and eating cheese and not being able to be inside the space where that origin was kind of created, that I like this idea of true. But holding ourselves inside that space can be a very, very complicated thing. And I think that's why we're here, you know? I think that's why this is a very necessary conversation. I wish I could stand up here and say, I know the ballast, I know the litmus test, I know how to bring it through. I am very curious of your father's original conversations to kind of figure out how to navigate that space. I'm very curious of these things and how people get into them, but I will not say that there's a full freeness of that responsibility. And hey, there's a risk too, right? And so that the risk is in the freedom, right? That you might get, you know, burnt to death by your readers, you know? I bet, you know, Elvis thought about that for about 1 second.
There was no internet yet.
Yeah, you know, and I think it's just a you know, a curious thing, but yeah, I'd be careful.
We should turn it over, I think, to the audience to see, and maybe some of the other responses can come out in that conversation.
May I appropriate 2 of your mics, please? Thank you very much.
Can I ask a question? Oh. So that was excellent. I have a question. So this whole notion of cultural appropriation, I'm always mystified because, I mean, clearly, I thought the whole notion of cultural appropriation debate came about because the publishing industry is really white. Authority has always belonged to the white gaze. You know, I belong in a field where the experts are all basically white people who, many of whom don't speak Korean, and the voice that when it's legitimized, it only goes to the victim. Experts are often, always, inevitably, white journalists, actually. So because of this problem, where, same thing with Heart of, you know, what was the title? Sorry. Heart in Darkness, right? I mean, that became the seminar text about Africa, the entire continent.
Because it's one country.
It's one country, right? So
we all know this.
Right, because the world is not perfect, I thought that we have now begun talking about cultural appropriation, but the debate always goes to this censorship, as if why can't we write about this? But I don't understand when, like, so that's my question, like, where is the censorship? I thought the whole point is, let's examine it more, and then criticism can actually come. You know, all book reviewers are generally also white. So, so it's about questioning the system, I thought. Like, there has never been censorship. It's just that you should be willing to be criticized if you write stuff that is basically bogus. And you're the authority. And they give you all your words, and you are now the, I don't know, like Pulitzer winning expert on this culture. But then, let's question that. So, where is the censorship? Nobody's saying you cannot write about this.
I feel like I do a I mean, yeah, thank you. You're right. People, particularly white authors, want to be able to write without criticism. They want to be able to write without consequence. They want to be able to write what they want without anyone saying there's anything even slightly wrong with it. And it's actually much easier to focus on that than it is to face the fact that the whole publishing industry is well, in the Western world anyway, the hands of power are still predominantly white, middle class-ish, male, predominantly in the particular high areas. And so that's much more difficult for people to face up to. Because when we talk about systems and structures are the things that are so entrenched we don't even see them. We take them as a given, right? We take those people to be authorities as a given. And when we start questioning, hopefully, and thanks for the question, when we start questioning what is the given, who gets to be the deciders of what content is seen and not seen, who gets to decide who is deemed an authority or not an authority, someone who actually speaks the language or someone who doesn't, someone who, and again, this comes down to people saying, well, I've put in a lot of work, I should be able to be the expert. But you have that privilege of even asking that question because you're already in a position of authority based on the position of power that you have in society.
Yeah, I think Heart of Darkness is a really compelling example because you know, it's one of those books which is so fascinating and clearly a classic, and yet it's deeply problematic. And you know, and Achebe, what Achebe does later is actually carry out an act of censorship. He essentially censors it. We don't call it censorship because we think of censorship as something coming from higher up, not from down below, but that's exactly what he was doing. And I think the big problem with the book is that he shows colonialism is a terrible thing, but it's terrible because of what it does to the soul of the colonizer. That it demonizes.
Oh my Lord.
It is not about, he doesn't give a shit about what it does to the colonized. That is not on the radar at all. It bestializes the colonizer. And that study of evil is what fascinates him. So I think these are the books and there are so many books like this. We need to also recognize that something which is aesthetically compelling can be politically deeply problematic.
But who gets to decide what is aesthetically compelling? Because again, we're saying that that's aesthetically compelling even though we know it's problematic, and the people that say that it's aesthetically compelling are not black people, are not African people. No African person's like, oh my God, let's read The Heart of Darkness. It's such a great book. No!
And that's true.
People that get to decide what is compelling, what is beautiful, what is art, are the people who are in positions of power and in the societies we live in. They are still white people. Like, let's not, this stuff is not objective. There is no objective beauty.
Absolutely, I completely agree with that.
Another question? Yeah, we just got 5 minutes. Someone in the front? Okay.
So I'm a science fiction writer, and for me, I'm always looking into the future. And I've read statistics, and I don't know if this is accurate, but they say something like in 2050, the minorities and majorities are going to sort of blend and switch. So I'm wondering, how does this change the conversation for you in a world where maybe the lines aren't as clearly defined or cultures are mixing?
There are just as many women in the world as there are men, but men are still in power. There are more women of color in the world than there are white women, and white women still hold the beauty standards. And like, also, you shouldn't have said sorry before you started. Sorry, as in like, you know, lean into your power. But just because there are more numbers of Chinese or Indian people in the world or people of color in the world does not mean they will be in power. And to think that is very, very dangerous. And you had a question?
Wow, yo, this is dope. My name is Itzhak Vida. I'm an organic gardener, b-boy, environmental hip-hop artist, and I've noticed a lot of things, you know, as writing music about environmental sustainability, you know, culinary wellness, regenerative agriculture, carbon sequestration, putting that in music, you know, and at the same time we're talking about like the bourgeoisie. A lot of people from the hood and urban cultures, they just don't read, but they listen to a lot of music. So to be able to address things like, you know, environmental sustainability, you know, it's very important to actually actively put that into, you know, the concept of the culture. Hip hop means higher inner peace, helping other people. But a lot of times when you see, you know what I'm saying, it gets real corny when like the wrong cat going to a school talking about, you know, let us turn up the beats. You know what I'm saying? But it can be fresh, you know what I'm saying? Like when you show up like the boombox and the blender and all that, and no, really though, so I was in Azerbaijan. I was flown out to Azerbaijan to speak on environmental sustainability and culinary wellness, and they were dealing with some waste diversion issues, and I noticed, because I just got my PhD in urban ecology, that I can speak easily to the hood and youth. But when I step into a culture of academia, when it's predominantly white, they definitely do not see me as a person from the hood. Oh, he can have a PhD. He doesn't look like, you know, he can speak well. You know,
you are so articulate for a black man.
Yeah. But that's exactly what I'm doing. You know, so like even in the process of writing my book, you know, and I'm interested in, you know, finding a private investor, because I realized that, you know, some of the concepts of publishing could have some rules and how you're able to market and who you're marketing to. And just had some questions on like exactly how are you able to speak about what you're speaking and still be respected, you know, in the communities of where you're coming from. Because I deal with that a lot. Like, you know, I had some backlash. About 2002, I wrote an album called, you know, The Produce Section, and, you know, a lot of people like, why are you talking about produce? You know, like, can't you talk about drugs and, like, you know, cars and the regular stuff we like? You know, but now there's MCs and rappers who are talking about sustainability and veganism and things like that, and it's culturally appropriate, and I'm just trying to figure out how do you get that on the move. So thank you. I mean, I think you're a great example of the success that you can be by taking that leap. I mean, in that specific vein, you've traveled that journey pretty much by yourself. I think that when you start kind of trying to pierce into these wider literary environments, I see the same difficulties and fears sometimes. I don't come from an environment of a literary background. I'm a performance poet. In fact, like if somebody came up there and tried to hop out in somebody else's skin on stage and do a poem from their perspective, like they would not pass. There are police in our space. So I don't know those rules in which you can sort of access those spaces more pronounced. Particularly, I think that, you know, understanding the risk that you're walking with and walking really proud in it is just going to create more access for yourself. And this individual who just asked this question is being enormously humble about his success inside of this world. This gentleman is one of the most famous people that I know in my life, and I think that, you know, from me to you, I mean, I just think that the taller that you walk, the more access you're going to keep finding yourselves in, and I know over your course you found that to be true.
Mm-hmm.